Welcome back to AAA Ball and Play. I'm Lee Walpole-Lassiter.
I'm Michael Aguero.
And today we're diving into one of the most interesting labor law questions in modern sports: wearable technology, biometric data, and who actually controls the information coming off of an athlete's body.
Because this is not just about gadgets anymore. This is about privacy, bargaining power, athlete rights, and money.
You're listening to the AAA Ball and Play podcast. Quick note, this is for education and entertainment. Nothing here is legal, tax, or financial advice, and nothing we say creates an athlete-agent relationship. Listening or contacting us does not make us your lawyers or your agents. For advice, talk to a qualified professional in your state. That's really the starting point. Wearable data is no longer just training data. It's health data, it's labor data, and potentially it is commercial data.
And once that happens, the issues change. And now we're not just asking whether a device helps a player recover faster. We're also asking whether a team can use the resulting information to shape contract value, future opportunity, or even public narrative.
Exactly. The technology may look small, but the legal consequences are huge. The current NBA-NBPA collective bargaining agreement was ratified in 2023, and it runs through the 2029-2030 season unless one side opts out after the 2028-2029 season.
And what matters for us is that the agreement has a dedicated section dealing with wearables. That alone tells you the parties know this is not a side issue.
Right. This is a negotiated labor governance framework for biometric information. That is a very different thing from teams just experimenting with tech on their own.
So what exactly counts as a wearable under the agreement?
A lot more than people think. The CBA defines wearables very broadly. We're talking about devices that measure movement information, physiological information, and other health, fitness, and performance information.
Which means this is not some cute little step counter trying to be invited to grown-up table.
Exactly. This is body data, not gadget data. We're talking about information that could include movement load, heart rate patterns, fatigue indicators, hydration-related signals, and other metrics that can shape how an athlete is viewed. The agreement creates and continues a joint wearables committee. So that committee includes league and union appointees, and it has a real governance role.
Which is important because if this were just left to one side, the balance of incentives could get ugly very fast.
Yes. The committee is part of the structural protection here. It helps review device use, approval, validation, and the broader handling of the data environment. So this is not just technology, it is jointly bargained oversight.
And the agreement gets more specific than a lot of people realize.
It actually gets very specific. It addresses approved systems, validation, and raw data exports and APIs. And that matters because the legal issue is not just the device itself, it's the pipeline that's feeding the information behind the device.
Meaning once the data leaves the wearable and moves into dashboards, exports, analytical tools, and models, you've got a much bigger control problem.
Exactly. Once raw data becomes interpreted data, inferred data, or modeled data, the question becomes who controls the meaning and future use of that information.
So can teams just require players to wear these devices?
Well, under the current NBA CBA, no. Teams may request wearable use only on a voluntary basis in practice or other non-game settings. Players can decline or stop using them at any time.
And that voluntariness language matters a lot.
It does. And before a team even asks, it has to provide the player with a written, confidential explanation of what the device measures, what those measurements mean, and how the player may benefit from the data.
So, at least on paper, the agreement is trying to build informed consent into the process.
Yes, and in pro sports, informed consent matters because voluntary can get weird real fast once roster pressures enter the room. Okay. This is where the CBA draws one of its most important lines. The player gets full access to all data collected on him from approved wearables.
Which sounds obvious, but in the real world, access rights are not always treated as automatic.
Exactly. Team staff may access the data too, but only for limited purposes such as player health, player performance, and on-court tactical or strategic purposes.
And the hard stop?
The hard stop is contract use. The agreement says that data may not be considered, used, discussed, or referenced in future player contract negotiations or other contract transactions like trades and waivers.
That may be the single most important protection in the whole section.
I think it is, because otherwise wearable data could become a backdoor tool for quietly depressing player value.
So is the, commercialization issue, is it settled?
Not really. The agreement says that pending further agreement, wearables may not be used in games, and player data collected from a wearable worn at a team's request may not be made public or used for commercial purposes.
So there is a barrier there.
Yes, a strong one, but it is still an interim barrier. It is not a fully elaborated final ownership regime. It is more like the parties saying nobody gets to commercialize this until we figure out how dangerous and valuable it really is. Which brings us to the ownership gap.
Meaning the agreement gives players important protections, but it does not fully solve who owns every downstream piece of the data story.
Exactly. Access rights are not the same as full ownership rights. Restricting misuse is not the same as settling who controls derivative analytics, inferred risk scores, retention periods, model outputs, or future monetization.
So the second life of the data is still unsettled.
Yes, that is a great way to put it, and that is the real battlefield here.
And that's where the idea of athlete data sovereignty comes in.
Exactly. Recent scholarship frames this not just as a privacy issue, but as a control issue. Who gets meaningful authority over data tied to an athlete's body performance and labor?
And that's a stronger frame than just, do players have privacy?
Yes, it's much stronger. Privacy is part of the puzzle, but power is the bigger puzzle. Control over collection, storage, sharing, retention, interpretation, and commercial value. That's the sovereignty question.
And then the G League makes this even more interesting.
Very much so. The published key deal points from the new G League agreement say players may be required to use approved wearable devices in games, practices, or other activities subject to guidelines and limitations.
Which is in major contrast with the public NBA framework.
Exactly. In the NBA, use stays voluntary and game use stays restricted, pending further agreement. In the G League, the public description sounds much more mandatory.
So what does that tell us?
Well, different league tier, different bargaining reality, same body, same data, but different leverage. So to be fair, there is a real and serious health argument in favor of this technology.
Absolutely. Better injury prevention, better recovery monitoring, better understanding of training loads. Those are the real benefits.
And that's why this is not an anti-technology argument. The problem is not that the data can help. The problem is that useful data also becomes valuable data. And once that happens, then control fights follow.
So this is the core legal tension, right?
Yes, exactly. The same data that can help heal can also help rank, classify, price, forecast, and maybe someday sell.
Which means the line between care and control is very thin.
Very, very thin. In data-rich sports, the same biometric stream can support injury prevention on one side and bargaining leverage on the other. That is why these rules matter.
And is there a bottom line?
Yes. So here's the bottom line. The NBA's current CBA is ahead of a lot of sports, most of them actually, and a lot of workplaces. It builds in joint oversight, validation, cybersecurity, player access, disclosure, voluntariness, and restrictions on contract side misuse.
That's real progress.
It is, but the deeper fight is still coming. The next question is not just who can collect the data. The real question who controls the second life of the data, the inferences, the retention, the analytics, the commercial value, and the story that the data tells about the athlete.
And that is why this matters far beyond basketball.
Yes. As a reminder, this episode is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice, it is not medical advice, and it is definitely not permission for your employer to hand you a smart ring and call it culture.
Please do not let the spreadsheet lick your soul.
Still one of the best workplace policies.
Now be sure to follow, subscribe, and stick with us here at the AAA Ball and Play podcast.
See you next time. You're listening to the AAA Ball and Play podcast. Quick note, this is for education and entertainment. Nothing here is legal, tax, or financial advice, and nothing we say creates an athlete-agent relationship. Listening or contacting us does not make us your lawyers or your agents. For advice, talk to a qualified professional in your state.